when even sunflower seeds and dumplings are labeled as threats. It exposes the absurdity and desperation behind Washington's containment strategy. UFLPA has no legitimate legal foundation. To talk about human rights and workers' concerns, it's a complete joke.
Hello everyone, welcome back to News Launch. I'm your host, Gao Fei. On July 31st, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security added 43 more Chinese companies to its entity list under the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. What makes this move particularly striking is the profile of the companies targeted. They are not the Euro high-tech or strategic sector firms we've come to expect under the U.S. controls. Instead, some of the most familiar household names in China, ChaCha Food, Synear Dumplings, and Sept Wolves, have now been included in the list. So the obvious question is, how does a company that sells sunflower seeds, frozen dumplings, or men's apparel pose a threat to U.S. national security? What is the real intention behind this expansion? Today, we are truly honored to welcome Professor Josef Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University, and a distinguished American scholar who has long focused on U.S.-China relations. Professor Mahoney will bring his years of experience and a sharp analysis of how Washington's narrative actually works. Professor Mahoney, thank you for joining our program.
Thanks for having me.
As we see, most of these companies produce daily consumer goods such as sunflower seeds, frozen dumplings, and clothing, and have nothing to do with the high-tech sectors like chips or AI. Is it logically justifiable for the U.S. to place them on its so-called forced labor list? What do you think is the true intention behind this move?
This move is logically indefensible. These consumer good firms have absolutely no connection to the so-called forced labor allegations, claims that are entirely fabricated and lack any factual basis. The U.S. true intention is clear: using groundless excuses to suppress China's competitive ordinary industries, disrupt the stability of China's industrial and supply chains, and protect the market share of its own traditional industries at the expense of Chinese enterprises' legitimate rights. When even sunflower seeds and dumplings are labeled as threats, it exposes the absurdity and desperation behind Washington's containment strategy.
And we noticed that this announcement comes at a particularly notable time. Just one day earlier, on July 30th, the leading officials for China-U.S. economic and trade affairs just held a video call, during which both sides agreed to maintain stable bilateral economic and trade relations. Yet only one day later, the U.S. unveiled such a sweeping set of restrictions. Professor Mahoney, how do you read this timing?
Well, the timing is a deliberate and calculated provocation. As you noted, this call just took place. And yet just 24 hours later, Washington unveiled this sweeping sanctions list. Now, this reveals a pattern. The U.S. uses engagement and escalation as two sides of the same policy. It aims to create unilateral leverage before the follow-up consultations, break the mutual trust just built, and force China into unnecessary concessions, completely violating the consensus reached by both parties.
Actually, this is the first expansion of the UFLPA Entity List under the Trump administration. So in your view, is this move driven more by so-called human rights concerns, or does it have more to do with domestic political calculations? Some analysts argue that expanding the list helps the White House blunt criticism from China hawks. Do you agree with that assessment?
I fully agree. This has nothing to do with human rights concerns. It is almost entirely driven by the U.S. domestic political calculations. You know, with the 2026 midterms approaching, demonstrating toughness on China remains one of the few issues capable of uniting Washington's bitterly divided political establishment. Now, Congress has consistently demanded more aggressive UFLPA enforcement, and expanding the entity list helps insulate the White House from criticism by China hawks, as you noted, while seemingly reinforcing its claims of strengthening supply chain security. The so-called human rights claim has nothing to do with this. It's nothing more than a convenient political fig leaf. Now, I think to put that in the right frame, let's recall the United States itself has a problem with sweatshop labor. It has a problem with prison labor. It still has a problem with the abuse of migrant labor. The protections for even its legal free workers are eroding. To talk about human rights and workers' concerns, it's a complete joke, given who's saying it. And furthermore, I think I think the whole world understands, given what we've seen in U.S. foreign policy, including the aggression against Venezuela, against Iran, against supporting the genocide in Gaza, the U.S. has no ground to stand on when it comes to human rights.
So you think it's just a tool for the U.S. to use to suppress the Chinese companies?
I think it's not just directed against Chinese companies, although clearly it is. I think it's something that they're using against countries around the world because Trump's justification for tariffs failed under Supreme Court scrutiny. So he's desperate to try to recover his own face ahead of elections.
China's Ministry of Commerce has characterized this move as a typical economic coercion. From an economic perspective, what impact will this have on China-U.S. trade and even the global trade order in the long run?
Well, I think, let's say this. If it's a short-term tactic ahead of meetings, then maybe it's not something that has long-term consequences. But I think we have to treat it like it's a serious attack. And therefore, we have to treat it like what it appears to be, which is blatant economic coercion, which could bring far-reaching harm. Now, it will severely undermine the already fragile mutual trust in China-U.S. trade and raise unnecessary barriers for normal bilateral commodity flows. More broadly, it breaks the WTO-based multilateral trade order, which is nothing new. Washington has been doing this repeatedly anyway, and disrupts the global layout of industrial chains. Now, as a globally traded commodity, cotton alone has a highly internationalized supply chain. U.S. sanctions harm the legitimate rights of Chinese companies while pushing more economies to face the spillover risks of arbitrary U.S. long-arm jurisdiction.
And what is your assessment of the legal foundation and enforcement criteria of the UFLPA? Are there ambiguities that could lead to its broad interpretation and application, effectively turning it into a tool to suppress Chinese companies, as you mentioned just now? And actually, the Xinjiang topic is often leveraged by the U.S. to shape an unfavorable narrative about China. What is your comment on that?
The first point is, I think in the context of international law, UFLPA has no legitimate legal foundation. In fact, again, it violates basic WTO rules and international trade norms. Its enforcement criteria are fatally flawed, adopting an unfair, rebutable presumption that treats all related entities as guilty without evidence. And by the way, that's something you can't do in the United States. You're innocent until proven guilty. So the U.S. is reversing this course and how it treats foreign companies. Now, importers must provide clear and convincing evidence. What is that? What's the standard to overcome this presumption? And again, we don't know what the standard is, but we can assume that it will be a demanding one that results in extremely low approval rates. The law arbitrarily expands restrictions without clear, consistent judgment. This reverses the fundamental legal principle of presumption of innocence, as I noted, turning it into a practice of prove your innocence or face blacklisting. Now, to speak to the point of Xinjiang, I was in Xinjiang recently, and I visiting many places. One of the things that is sort of interesting is that anyone can go to Xinjiang. It welcomes all visitors. I remember I was at a factory that makes combines, large machines that harvest cotton and other goods. One of the interesting things we know about the cotton industry in Xinjiang is that there's no forced labor, period. And not only that, most of it has been mechanized. It's big machines doing the work. And I put a finer point on it. I was at one of these leading firms that's producing these machines, not only for the domestic market, but also internationally. The workers that I saw working in that factory were teams led by female engineers from people all over China. And they included Uyghurs who were there as professionals, who were happy to have their jobs, who were contributing positively, who were not examples of forced labor or slave labor or whatever you want to call it.
But for the people who have never been to Xinjiang, they may be misguided by the Western media report. How do you think about that?
We see this, I think, in a lot of different contexts. I'm here in Shanghai. They've been subjected for many years now in the West, but also in places like Japan with these really dark, negative, anti-China narratives, and they are absolutely astounded when they come here and see for themselves how peaceful it is, how safe and secure it is, how people's well-being is put first, and that's true whether they go to Urumqi or Karame or Kashgar or Yunnan, Kunming, wherever it is. The conditions are the same. Now, in terms of how do you counteract those kind of narratives? Not everyone can afford, unfortunately, to travel to China, especially many Americans who find their position eroding economically because of the very policies that the current administration is putting into place. So they're kind of trapped in economic decline, and they're being misled into sort of blaming others for their problems. The same thing is happening in Japan, by the way. The current prime minister in Japan is unable to offer a meaningful economic reform that would restore the Japanese economy to health. And so as a result is ramping up new policies, new laws that aim to foster militarization and target countries in the region, including China. And by the way, I've talked to Japanese diplomats in the past who concede that part of the problem is they're unable to deal with their problems because the economic elites in Japan who control the media don't want to change the status quo. They understand that reform is necessary for the national good, but they're entrenched. They're still making their money. They don't want to change. And so they continue to manipulate media to try to manipulate public opinion so that they can hold on to fortune and power. A similar phenomenon is happening in the United States, although the complexities of political polarization and overall geostrategic decline make the issue a little more acute. To be honest with you, I think we're starting to see a sea change among young people. I think there's a growing segment of the U.S. population. The U.S. is pointing its finger and blaming other people, but the U.S. is actually instigating the problems that are worsening our own situation at home. So that level of criticality, I think, has sort of entered the discussion now, and I think it's creating an opening for people to take a more balanced look at China. And listen, the fact of the matter is, we're still developing in China. We still have a lot of room for growth and development and improvement and reform. This is something that China admits again and again.
Let's get back to the economic move by the U.S. It not only hurts the trade relation between China and the U.S., but also influence the global trade order. So how do you foresee the development of China-U.S. relations in the coming years, and what factors will shape their future development? Because China and the U.S. are both major powers in the world, so what global impacts will the state of bilateral ties bring to the world?
It's a huge question. I think that, when we look at something, let me give you a couple of examples of how complicated it gets. On the one hand, we know the United States, for example, is facing what some perceive as a strategic defeat in its conflict with Iran. On the other hand, that attack disrupted global energy supplies, and it has forced Europe into a much more defensive position. And this defensive position, unfortunately, even though the United States instigated this, has encouraged Europe to take a more protectionist position against China, because Europe is now facing an even greater risk of deindustrialization. They survived and used up all their resources surviving being cut off from Russian energy with the U.S. proxy war with Russia over Ukraine. But now with the market disruptions, the energy market disruptions, they're tapped. They don't have much room to pivot to try to insulate themselves. So they're tremendous risk for deindustrialization. Now, a lot of these firms, if they're looking for a stable country to go that has the world's most advanced industrial system, a lot of them would choose to leave Europe and move to China, and that terrifies European policymakers. So they're moving in the direction of more protectionism to counter the risks increased by the United States, which of course brings complications to China's relationship with the EU, but perhaps serves U.S. strategic interests, which want to try to discipline and break the EU once and for all. The U.S. has always been strategically opposed to the EU and the euro. It was always something that was created as a means to resist U.S. hegemony. And with U.S. support for Brexit, and now what we've seen with the U.S. doing with other policies, both under Biden and Trump, the EU has been substantially diminished and disciplined. So this has global implications, not just implications for China, but implications for Europe, for Africa, for everywhere else. Now, I do think that a lot of countries around the world are seeing these developments, and they're realizing the risk that Europe faces and how Europe has been corralled. And they see the same thing in Japan. And they realize that if they want to avoid the boot hill of American hegemony, they have to find more constructive alternatives. And these, in fact, are the alternatives that China is offering them. So I do think it raises some significant headwinds for the short term. I do think it will complicate relations not only between China and the United States, but also potentially China and Europe, as well as China and Japan. But it also provides, I think, some compelling reasons for other countries in the world, especially those in the global South, to draw closer to China, to sort of sustain their own sovereign rights and ability to advance according to their own agendas.
And what are your suggestions for both countries to solve these problems?
Over the next couple of years, my position is that the United States is facing a relative decline. It's being hollowed out from within by itself, and it's still engaged in sort of imperial overreach globally. Increasingly, the world is building alternatives to that type of U.S.-dominated model. And these are maturing, and eventually we'll reach a tipping point where we can expect some sort of cascade effect and rapid transformation. And I think that's an assessment that the Trump administration shares. They're certainly concerned about that type of scenario. So, how that plays out in the long term and the short term remains to be seen. I do think China is probably the country best positioned in the world to weather those type of risks and to even moderate them to some extent, not only for the good of China, but for the rest of the world. So my long-term belief is that China will be just fine. It will work through this. The U.S. has a difficult future. If the U.S. can moderate its position, then I think China would be willing to help the U.S. find a more positive path forward. China certainly doesn't want to see the U.S. collapse or create some massive global upheaval. But I think what we have seen is considerable restraint from the Chinese side, from the first Trump administration to the Biden administration to the second Trump administration. China has consistently demonstrated that it has not taken advantage of the U.S. in moments of U.S. weakness or failure. In fact, it helped the U.S. and the rest of the world considerably in 2020 during the worst days of the pandemic. And it could have exploited the U.S. strategic failures in Iran, and it hasn't done that. It has been a responsible major power that has committed itself to stability over conflict. And if the U.S. can wake up to that realization, while at the same time figure out a way to change its behavior and commitment to structural inequalities, which is difficult, then I think we might find the two countries being able to move together in a way that would better result in a shared future for humanity.
Thank you. The relations between China and the US have always been a very important topic to discuss. And thank you, Professor Mahoney, for your insightful and thought-provoking sharing with us today. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.